Hey folks, Seth here to talk to you about how to measure yourself for garb. Now, the easiest way to measure someone for garb is to have 3 people, a model, a measurer, and a scribe. We don't have a scribe on camera right now, but we're just going to pretend. So the way that works is the model will hold still and move as the measurer needs, and the measurer will announce, okay, 16-inch shoulders, and the scribe will write it down. If you don't have that many people, if you only have 2, the easiest way to do it is to have the model also be holding a pen and notebook, so that the measuring person doesn't have to keep picking things up and putting them down. If you're measuring yourself, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to pick stuff up and put it down. Now, when you're measuring another person, it is very important to be measuring in straight lines as close to the skin as possible without actually pinching. So can I see your arm, please? So you want a relatively loose wrap, you don't want to pull, and you don't want to sag. You also want to avoid angles because it can give you another ½ inch or more to a measurement that you really don't need. So that was a 9-inch measurement. For measuring, when you're designing your own things, generally speaking, you want to have your design down and set before you start measuring. And once you're done measuring, you can start buying fabric. It really sucks to buy your fabric and find out you either bought twice as much as you need because you're smaller than the drafting pattern assumed, or you need to go back to the store, which can be an errand, it can mean piecing, it can just be a big hassle. Do we have any questions so far? Yes?
Can you define piecing, please?
Piecing is the art of adding a little bit more to the edge of fabric. So if the piece you're cutting is a little too small for the entire shape you're cutting out of it, it's actually pretty easy when you're sewing to add that little bit more. So you might have a corner that's from a different cut of the fabric. You might have a hem that is from a different angle of fabric. It's very common, it's actually relatively simple to do. That whole measure twice, cut once thing only mostly applies to sewing because it's actually really easy to just sew an extra ½ inch onto the side. Any other questions? Yes?
Whenever you're measuring biceps,
Yes.
Is it better to measure with your arm folded as opposed to having it straight?
That is an excellent question. It depends on what you're going to be doing and what you're sewing out of. Not much. If you are a person whose bicep, when flexed, is significantly larger, and you're sewing out of a fabric that doesn't have much flex to it, it is better to sew with your bicep its full size, so you know you'll have enough space in the finished product, especially if you're doing something athletic in it. For things like court garb, things that you're adding a whole bunch of ease to, things you're sewing out of stretch knits, it's less important, but use your better judgment. Any other questions?
Especially if you're going to do feast garb stuff.
Yes.
Flexing a lot.
When measuring legs, do you measure straight up and down? And for width, do you measure thigh and calf separately?
It depends on what you're making. This is part of why it's important to have your either your pattern or your drafting instructions before you start measuring, because for something like a very loose-fitted harem pant, the only measurements that actually matter are belly button to crotch, around the ankle and around the waist. If you're doing something tighter fit, like a pair of rust pants or a tight-fitting kilt, the measurement changes. Any other questions? Okay. That was all I have for right now. Message me if you have any questions. I'm usually online and happy to answer.
Just one more question.
Yes.
So, obviously there's different measurements for different things, but what are kind of the major measurements that you would want to look for?
So the major measurements you look for are widths around different points of your body and the lengths between those widths. So the Lady Armstrong tunic in particular measures at the shoulder blade, around the widest part of the chest, and around the narrowest part of the stomach, and around the hip. Then you measure between those individual points on your model. There is some math involved. The Lady Armstrong tutorial goes through the math with you fairly in depth. but those are the general points you want to measure. Okay, I think we're done. Yes.
So I know some measuring tapes, the inch mark, that very first mark at the very end, isn't always the same on each measuring tape. Is there a way to get around that to avoid that possible
So,
unusual measurement?
So if you're good at keeping track of things and good at being detail oriented, it's not hard to use the 1 inch mark as your beginning point, and wrap around normally and measure from 1 inch to say 16 inches and just know that that's a 15-inch measurement. If you feel like you have a kind of bunk measuring tape, quite honestly, buy a new one. They're cheap. If you don't have time to buy a new one, do some math. I know math is hard. I'm not good at it either, but
Math is gorgeous.
math is annoying.
Says the mathematician.
Okay, I think we're done.